He wasn't yet El León de la Sierra, the Lion of the Mountain. Before anyone whispered his name in the folds of the Sierra Madre, before clandestine runways scarred the earth, before the world learned to fear the shadows that rode across the sky, there was just a boy. A boy born into a mountain world where time moved differently. On the surface, it was slow, but underneath, it was silently shaping a destiny. Pedro Avilés Pérez was born in Tamazula, Durango, on April 11, 1931. His world was carved by rock, slope, fog, and a stubborn, isolating silence. Children growing up there learned two truths before they could even write their own names. The government was a distant rumor, and your survival depended entirely on your ability to read the land better than any book. The mountains didn't just give you food because you were hungry. You had to learn how to make the earth obey, how to pull something valuable out of what looked like nothing. His childhood wasn't what you might imagine for a man who would one day shape an empire. There was no golden crib, no prophecy whispered over him. The transformation that would make him a pioneer of a criminal era came much, much later. As a child, he knew something far simpler and more ancient. Scarcity. Not the drama of disaster or ruin, just a constant grinding scarcity that made every object, every opportunity, every tiny advantage matter intensely. From a very early age, he developed quiet traits that rarely get noticed in a young boy. He was patient. He listened far more than he spoke. He studied the way people moved, the way things worked, without ever announcing his conclusions. Elders would sometimes see him sitting perfectly still for long stretches, as if he were waiting for a conversation that hadn't started yet. Years later, those who told his story said the same thing in different ways. He had the temperament of a man who calculates while everyone else complains. Now, there were classrooms in the Sierra, but not the kind you're thinking of. His education was dictated by distance. When getting to a school took hours of walking over rough terrain, formal teaching happened in fragments. A book was a rare and precious artifact. Whatever letters he learned not because a system demanded it, but because he understood, even as a boy, that knowledge was leverage. His real education was environmental. He learned how to judge terrain by looking at the angle of a shadow, not the color of the soil. He learned how human nature warps when the economy is thin and people are desperate. He saw how rumors could travel faster than facts, and how the laws of the state and the laws of the mountains were two entirely different things. These lessons, which seem almost primitive on the surface, later translated into a masterful instinct for operations. Predict risk, reduce your exposure, and exploit the gaps no one else sees. Long before he ever touched anything illegal, these patterns were being imprinted on his mind. Pedro was born into a Mexico still finding its footing after revolutionary turmoil. The country's institutions were fragile, especially in rural areas. And on the horizon, the United States, vast, industrial, and hungry, exerted a powerful gravitational pull. Anything that was scarce in Mexico but desired in America would eventually attract someone bold enough to turn that desire into a route, into a business. But back in the 1930s and 40s, during his youth, those corridors weren't fully open yet. The trade that would define his adult life was still just an embryo. He grew up in the prehistory of the modern drug world. The rules hadn't been written yet, which meant that eventually someone would have to write them. He just didn't know it would be him. There's a kind of discipline that isn't forged by teachers or sermons, but by the land itself, and sheer necessity. Boys who grow up walking long distances learn endurance before they even know the word ambition. Boys who watch adults improvise a living out of thin air learn pragmatic cunning before they learn formal ethics. And boys who see the state as nothing more than a rumor learn to trust their own calculations far more than any external authority. Pedro learned all three. He learned that people respect competence more than they respect titles. He learned that information, who knows what, and who knows it first, is a currency all its own. And he learned that men who can solve problems that others consider impossible gain a kind of gravitational pull without ever having to ask for it. But he also learned something more subtle, something decisive. In the mountains, the system doesn't punish initiative, it punishes visibility. That single piece of logic, act but do not appear to act, would later become the operating DNA for the entire first generation of large-scale smugglers. Every empire has a long, invisible preface, a period of compression where potential quietly accumulates. Nothing about Pedro's youth would have interested a reporter or a historian. There was no file on him. And yet, everything in his youth was like a spring being slowly coiled. He was born in a place where the formal economy couldn't feed everyone, meaning alternative economies were inevitable. He belonged to a generation that reached adulthood at the exact moment those alternative economies were ready to scale up. He possessed the perfect temperament for organization, not for explosive violence, and he lived in a geography that served as the natural rear base for any underground supply chain connecting the mountains to the border, and the border to the cities. Nothing had happened yet, but all the pieces, the man, the environment, the timing, the temperament, and the hunger, were quietly assembling themselves. Before he became a name that traveled on the wind, he was just a man with no name beyond his small world. His identity was forged long before his notoriety. He learned how to move within a community without drawing suspicion. He learned how to keep secrets. He figured out who could be trusted and who couldn't. A mental catalog that would later become more valuable than any financial ledger. And in doing so, he learned the first law of any high-risk enterprise. If people cannot predict you, they cannot stop you. That restraint, so uncommon in a young man, was the embryo of operational security, long before he would have ever heard that phrase. The first encounters with opportunity didn't come with a bang. In the mountains, these things never advertised themselves. You discovered them in fragments. A cousin who knew a guy, a rumor about a shipment, a quiet transaction accidentally witnessed in the twilight, a whisper about profit margins so large they seemed like fiction. At this stage, Pedro was not yet a participant. He was a listener. He was an observer. He watched which men gained wealth without any visible occupation. He noted which paths were taken at night, but never during the day. He saw how silence protected profit far better than bravado, and he absorbed a foundational truth. Every illicit enterprise is, first and foremost, a logistics problem. It's not a moral problem. Whoever solves the logistics wins. Slowly, quietly, he was beginning to see the map that others were walking on without ever understanding its true layout. By the time he moved from adolescence into early adulthood, 3 pillars of his personality were fully formed. First, patience without paralysis. He could wait for the right moment, but he was never just drifting. Second, ambition without display. He wanted more, much more, but he never announced it to the world. And third, risk reasoning without panic. He could evaluate danger without letting emotion cloud his judgment. These traits don't automatically create a cartel architect, but they make one possible. If you could travel back in time and stand in his village when he was 20 years old, nothing about him would give you a clue about the future. His story, at that point, looked like a story without any movement. But this is how the deepest pivots in history begin. Slowly, invisibly, under the cover of ordinary life. We only ever see the results later. We rarely get to witness the silent engineering of a mind leaning toward a line of work that doesn't even have a name yet, let alone prestige or infrastructure. He was becoming something that didn't exist. A first-generation architect of an undeclared economy. There were no aircraft yet, no established corridors, no consolidated networks, no federal manhunts. There was only the alignment of a man, his environment, his temperament, and the historical moment. It was a plot line forming without any single dramatic event to announce it. A prelude without fireworks, but one that would have world-changing consequences. As Pedro Avilés Pérez grew up, the Mexico around him was transforming, quietly but surely. Paved roads appeared in some places but not others. The reach of the law extended through the cities but grew thin in the mountains. And just across the border, the United States was entering an era of massive consumption, creating a demand that legal channels simply couldn't satisfy. In a landscape like this, the first step into the underground is rarely a dramatic leap. It's subtle, a favor for a friend, an introduction to someone new, a cargo that looks like one thing but is actually another. For someone with Pedro's temperament, observant, restrained, and calm, the change happened just like the man himself. There was no grand rebellion, no visible break from his old life. Just a quiet shift in what was being moved, and who it was being moved for. The moment someone crosses into an illegal enterprise, it rarely feels like a life-altering choice. It feels like an opportunity. Pedro started the way most first-generation traffickers did. Not by designing a vast network, but by joining a small piece of someone else's route. In the beginning, he wasn't calling the shots. He was just following orders. The skills needed at this stage weren't leadership or brutality. They were reliability and the ability to go unnoticed. The men who brought him in saw he had both. But from the very start, Pedro approached each task differently. He wasn't just a courier. He was a future system builder disguised as one. He spotted inefficiencies others ignored. He learned to identify who leaked information just by the way they talked. He understood that timing was more critical than speed, and that being predictable was the most dangerous trait a courier could have. He wasn't just doing the job. He was studying its architecture. The education he never received in a classroom, he found in the trade. He learned about capital that left no public trace. He studied the logic of the border and the rhythms of surveillance. He saw firsthand how trust is built in illegal markets, where a man's word is everything. Most importantly, he witnessed how wealth in the region was starting to detach itself from legality. He mapped out the hierarchy in his mind: the producers who grew the product, the movers who transported it, the protectors who ensured its safety, and the financiers who backed it all. Sometimes these roles were held by the same men. Other times, they were separate, isolated compartments. But the most valuable lesson he learned was that the ultimate prize wasn't the land or the product. It was control of the routes. Whoever controlled the arteries of transport controlled the future. This was the insight that would one day make him a pioneer. In the clandestine world, a reputation isn't built on noise. It's built on silence. It's earned by making sure others don't have to worry. Pedro didn't improvise. He delivered. Exactly as promised. Every single time. Slowly, the men who commanded others began to see him not as a replaceable carrier, but as a potential coordinator. The difference between a worker and a future boss is plain to see for those already at the top. It is the ability to think 3 moves ahead without being told to. Pedro wasn't at the top yet, but he was no longer at the bottom. His rise wasn't just a story of personal ambition. It was almost inevitable, driven by powerful forces converging at the perfect time. First, there was the explosion of demand from the United States. The market to the north wanted more product, and they wanted it delivered consistently. Second, law enforcement in rural Mexico was weak. The state simply couldn't police the vast, rugged mountains where these new enterprises were taking root. And third, the trafficking of that era was stuck in a bottleneck. Ground routes were profitable, but they were slow and incredibly vulnerable. Someone was bound to try and break that bottleneck. And it wouldn't be someone reckless. It would be someone disciplined, observant, and intelligent about risk. It would be Pedro Avilés Pérez. Before he ever dreamed of taking to the skies, Pedro built something more fundamental. A dependable cell of men whose loyalty flowed upward and whose silence radiated outward. Men followed him not because he threatened them, but because he protected them by not exposing them to unnecessary risk. He ran his circle the same way he lived his life, with quiet restraint. In the mountains, leadership isn't declared with a loud voice. It's recognized in small gestures. People started asking him questions instead of giving him orders. Others would align their decisions with his recommendations. Men would wait for his opinion before committing to a plan. He wasn't the architect of a new generation just yet, but the outline was already visible. Before a person can change an entire industry, something has to change inside their mind first. Pedro began to see the absolute limits of the existing logistics. Roads meant checkpoints. Roads meant predictability. Roads meant that the risk grew with every pound of product you moved. To meet America's insatiable appetite, ground transport was becoming a choke point. This is the point where most people would stop. They might try to adjust the volume, but not the method. Pedro didn't. He looked up. Moving by air solved 3 critical problems at once: speed, distance, and the risk of interception. But an innovation this massive required more than just imagination. It required nerve, capital, pilots, protection, and above all, secrecy. Before he moved a single ounce by air, he spent years mentally engineering the entire system, figuring out every piece of the puzzle. Innovation in crime, just like in science, doesn't start with action. It starts with a new frame of mind, one that refuses to accept old limits. As his internal plans took shape, his external reputation grew with them. His name started to travel beyond his immediate circle, not as a whisper of violence, but as a signal of competence. People trusted him with their risk because he treated risk rationally, like a calculation, not an emotional gamble. In a world where ego destroys more men than the law ever could, Pedro's self-discipline made him an anomaly. His network of contacts soon stretched beyond one valley, one town, one corridor. He began connecting different worlds. The growers in the mountains to the roots to the border, and the border to the buyers in the north. This crucial role as a bridge isn't given to the impulsive or the flashy. It's earned by the reliable. In every career, whether legal or illegal, there comes a point of no return. Pedro reached his not with a bang, but through quiet integration. Too many people depended on him. Too many shipments were routed through decisions that he made. He held too much knowledge in his head to ever go back to being anonymous. There wasn't a single moment where he declared to himself, "I'm in this for life." He simply arrived at a state where an exit no longer existed. From this point forward, his life wouldn't be defined by whether he participated in the trade, but by how far he would push the system he had inherited. He wasn't just going to work within the existing structure. He was going to alter it forever. And the first, most radical alteration would be the sky itself. In the rugged mountains where some see endings, a man named Pedro Avilés Pérez saw a beginning. But the ceiling wasn't just the peaks above him. It was economic. It was physical. A man on a horse, a man in a truck, even a man with a stubborn mule. They all answered to the same masters: treacherous terrain and the ever-present eye of the law. Pedro was the first of his kind to stop looking at the dusty, winding roads, and instead lift his gaze to the sky. Until then, the sky was just empty. Empty of commerce, empty of conflict, and empty of opportunity. He grasped a concept so simple it was revolutionary. If the law expects crime to crawl along the ground, the ultimate advantage isn't found in better hiding spots, but in a higher altitude. Aviation wasn't a reckless gamble for Pedro. It was a calculated solution, assembled with immense discipline. Before a single engine roared to life, he knew he needed 6 essential ingredients. First, pilots who valued silence more than a fat paycheck. Second, aircraft. Sturdy, reliable planes that could kiss the earth on a makeshift dirt strip in the dead of night. No lights, no ceremony. Third, he needed those strips themselves. Runway-grade clearings, carved silently into the mountain seams, hidden in plain sight. Fourth, ground crews who operated on instinct and timing, who didn't need to ask why, only when. Fifth, he required partners on the other side of the border, receivers with the capacity to handle volume, and the composure to never break a sweat. And finally, the ghost in the machine. Intermediaries who could make a paper trail vanish faster than the authorities could even pick up the scent. He didn't build this network overnight. It was a slow, incremental process, not an impulsive one. He never asked his men to understand the grand vision. He didn't distribute a blueprint that could be leaked. Instead, he gave out microtasks, small pieces of a puzzle that only he could see in its entirety. The first flights didn't thunder across the border announcing a new era. There was no media frenzy, no dramatic interceptions, no blaring headlines. In the underworld, true innovation rarely starts with a bang. It begins with a quiet, unnerving absence of resistance. Those early trips were modest, not in their world-changing significance, but in their volume. Pedro wasn't chasing massive profits just yet. He was chasing proof of concept. He needed to prove that aviation could work silently before it could work on a massive scale. And it did. Once you discover a method that operates without detection, scaling up is no longer an act of courage. It's just simple arithmetic. With this new aerial highway under his control, Pedro stopped being just another influential player. He became a precedent, a model, a template that others, years later, would copy, expand, and turn into weapons of economic warfare. Long before the world would tremble at names like Caro Quintero, Fonseca Carrillo, or the infamous El Chapo Guzman, the very operational grammar they would all use was being written quietly by Pedro Avilés. He had taken the old, tired rule: move what you can through the terrain, and replaced it with a bold new one. Redefine the terrain by simply ignoring it. Suddenly, a system, an invisible empire, began to take shape under his command. No map could ever have drawn its borders. It consisted of production zones, shielded by their sheer isolation and defended by a culture of absolute opacity. It had the aerial lifts, the core of his innovation, bypassing the entire ground-level enforcement grid. It had buffer brokers, human firewalls insulating the command structure from the dirty work on the ground. It had border partners, the crucial link that converted product into currency. And finally, it had sophisticated financial channels, designed not for flashy displays of wealth, but for recycling earnings back into expansion, feeding the beast and making it stronger. This wasn't just a series of lucky breaks or clever improvisations. This was architecture. Cold, calculated, brilliant architecture. His name became a signal, a diagnostic tool within the trade. If you heard an operation had Pedro's hand on it, you knew three things for certain. 1. It would be timed with precision, not rushed. 2. It would be executed, not just talked about. And 3. It would be protected by silence, not boasted about in cantinas. Men who had never once laid eyes on him, who couldn't pick his face out of a crowd, knew his effect. They felt his influence in the rhythm and reliability of the trade. As the network of secret air routes multiplied, so did the number of people who depended on it. Growers relied on his planes to lift their harvests from remote fields. Pilots depended on his protection to fly their routes safely. Receivers on the other side depended on his impeccable timing. Financiers depended on the constant, predictable turnover of product and cash. Pedro's decisions now had second- and third-order consequences, rippling out across the entire underground economy. An empire was forming, long before anyone thought to call it one. At this point, he wasn't a myth or a legend. He was a mechanism. A perfectly running, silent, and incredibly powerful machine. By the mid-1970s, the sheer volume of product flowing into the United States owed more to the quiet foundation builders like Pedro than to any of the loud, branded cartels that would later dominate the headlines. But governments don't respond to origins, they respond to visibility. And Pedro operated deep beneath the surface of visibility. His fingerprints weren't on seized contraband or front-page mugshots. They were on the invisible flows of a cross-border economy he had fundamentally reshaped. He did all this without ever becoming a famous public villain during his own lifetime. The kind of recognition history gives is almost always retroactive. And here lies the paradox of these foundational figures. Their legacy is cemented long before their decline even begins. Even if Pedro had stopped right then, if he had simply vanished from the map, the industry would have continued rolling along the tracks he had laid. Once a new, superior method is introduced into an economy, it doesn't die with its inventor. It takes on a life of its own. Pedro Avilés hadn't just profited from the trade, he had fundamentally changed its physics. By the end of this period, his trajectory was set. He controlled a method that his rivals couldn't hope to match. He connected disparate actors who had previously operated in isolation, creating a cohesive, powerful network. He had turned geography from a limitation into a strategic advantage. Most importantly, he had made himself indispensable without ever making himself visible. What lay ahead were the inevitable consequences of that success. The unwanted glare of political attention, the poison of internal envy, the structural tensions of a rapidly growing organization, the emergence of new rivals, and the eventual, unavoidable confrontation with the state. The sky had made him powerful, but that same power would soon make him a target. The silent architect was about to be thrust from the shadows and into recorded history. By the mid-1970s, Pedro's aviation system wasn't just managing shipments. It was orchestrating a delicate balance of power. The trade in his era hadn't yet splintered into the rival cartels we know today. Instead, it was a world of influence zones. And Pedro was one of the very few whose influence spanned across these zones, all without a formal title or a crown. He had become what large institutions fear most: a quiet architect, a man whose decisions changed reality faster than the law could ever hope to keep up. He wasn't just a player. He became a central node, a sun that others began to orbit. Names that would later dominate headlines, Fonseca Carrillo, Caro Quintero, Felix Gallardo, were already making their moves. But at this point, they weren't the kings they would become. Many of them either worked under, learned from, or negotiated through the very infrastructure Pedro had painstakingly built. They were carving out their own ambitions, yes, but they were doing it on ground that he had leveled first. Pedro was the teacher history rarely gives credit to, because his classroom had no blackboard, only roots, rules, and results. Of course, no organization operating on this scale stays invisible forever. Intelligence agencies began to notice strange patterns, but they couldn't put a name to them. They saw shipments increasing without any new known bosses. They made seizures that hinted at larger unseen actors pulling the strings. The behavior at the border was changing in ways that their old files simply couldn't explain. At this stage, the authorities didn't know Pedro, the man or the myth. They only knew him as a missing variable, an unnamed cause behind very measurable effects. The state was now aware of a few key facts. Someone was coordinating airborne logistics with terrifying precision. Someone was dramatically reducing interception losses. Someone was uniting suppliers who had previously been fierce competitors. And someone had turned a quiet rural region into a strategic superhighway. They didn't know who yet, but they knew the someone existed. And when one man's efficiency completely upends an industry, not everyone celebrates. Some were elevated by his precision, their profits soaring. But others were displaced, left behind by the new model. The underworld, after all, doesn't operate on gratitude. Influence breeds admiration from students, but it also creates deep discomfort among rivals, even those who depended on the very system he created. Pedro now found himself standing at a dangerous crossroads where three critical risks converged. First, the quiet, tightening gaze of the state. Second, the ambitious protégés he had trained, who were learning fast and getting hungry. And third, the competitors who were coldly calculating whether his dominance was a permanent fixture or a temporary obstacle. When one man becomes too central to everything, he becomes one of two things, either fiercely protected or dangerously replaceable. And in the trade, questions like that never remain unanswered for long. Yet, even at the absolute height of his power, Pedro never engaged in theatrics. He led the same way he rose, quietly and effectively. He delegated tasks without losing control. He maintained a strict insulation, keeping himself several steps removed from the action on the ground. He avoided unnecessary spectacle, understanding that attention was a liability. And most importantly, he invested in his methods, not in building a personal myth. He didn't build loyalty with charisma. He built it with something far more valuable in his world: predictability. In criminal markets, trust isn't about affection. It's about the removal of uncertainty. If Pedro said a flight would happen within a specific window, it happened. If he said silence was mandatory, silence was absolute. That unwavering reliability made him the indispensable linchpin of an entire ecosystem. And here's the crucial part. His legacy was already cemented, long before his fall ever began. Even if Pedro had vanished from the face of the earth at that very moment, the industry would not have reverted to its old, clumsy ways. Aviation was now the standard. Centralized coordination was now the expectation. The idea that power came from controlling routes, not just territory, was now a fundamental truth. He hadn't just succeeded. He had completely redesigned the baseline for everyone who came after him. From the outside, the landscape looked stable. Shipments moved like clockwork, profits flowed, and alliances held firm. But beneath that calm surface, the pressure was building relentlessly. The Mexican state could no longer afford to ignore such blatant violations of its airspace. U.S. intelligence agencies were starting to push hard for cross-border cooperation to tackle this new, sophisticated threat. His own protégés were becoming powerful enough to dream of autonomy, to want their own kingdoms. His incredible success had made him simultaneously necessary and vulnerable. The story of all long-running dominance ends the same way. First, it's admired. Then, it's monitored. And finally, it's targeted. By the state, by rivals, or, in the most dangerous cases, by both at the same time. Pedro had reached that critical point in his story, the moment where history stops recording growth and begins recording the lead-up to a collision. The sky had made him a king, but the attention he now commanded would make him mortal. The next stage of his journey was no longer about expansion. It was about the inevitable confrontation that was now fast approaching on the horizon. History isn't always about the loudest person in the room. Sometimes it's about the quiet architect who designs the room itself. Today, we're not talking about the famous names you think you know. We're talking about the man who wrote the first chapter, the blueprint that everyone else followed. Pedro Avilés Pérez. His story isn't one of a dramatic fall from grace. He didn't grow weak. He grew too big, too effective. So large, in fact, that the system itself could no longer tolerate his existence outside its control. By the late 1970s, a perfect storm was brewing. Three powerful forces, all closing in at once. First, the state, which was furious that someone had rewritten the rules of logistics without asking for permission. Second, the emerging generation of ambitious heirs, eager to take over an industry that no longer needed its founding father. And third, international intelligence agencies, pressuring Mexico to make a public display of enforcement. Pedro had become the central pillar, the very architecture of his illicit empire. And history has a recurring pattern for figures like him. Once a single person becomes the entire structure, the world starts engineering their removal. It's a law of nature in these circles. When you're that essential, you're also that much of a target. But this wasn't a Hollywood movie. There was no epic shootout, no high-speed chase through dusty streets, no dramatic last stand meant for ballads. What happened was far colder, far more calculated. It was removal by inevitability. Think about that for a moment. Authorities and rivals weren't trying to negotiate with him. They started negotiating around him. They began planning for a future where he was simply absent. That single shift in thinking, that collective assumption that he was already gone, was the real beginning of the end. The countdown had started, not with a bang, but with a whisper in back rooms and closed-door meetings. All power, right before it collapses, takes on one final, telling form. People start acting as if the powerful man is already a ghost. When your potential successors are already carving up your kingdom before you've even fallen, your fall is no longer a possibility. It's an appointment on the calendar. And so, Pedro's end arrived just as he had ruled, without noise. His life didn't conclude on a public stage, under the glare of spotlights. It ended in the very shadows he had once so skillfully mastered. There was no final confession, no tell-all memoir, no attempt to build his own myth. He simply vanished from the board. But here's the twist. The silence of his exit didn't erase him. In a strange way, it amplified his legacy. Because when Pedro disappeared, his system did not. The routes he pioneered remained open. The people he trained stayed active. The model he created continued to be the dominant force in the industry. He was removed from the game, but the rulebook he wrote was still in play. His physical presence was gone, but his influence was more present than ever. What followed was the inheritance of his blueprint. Men whose names would echo through the decades. Felix Gallardo, Fonseca Carrillo, Caro Quintero. They didn't start from scratch. They weren't inventors. They were continuers. They took the architecture that Pedro had designed and scaled it up to unimaginable levels. Pedro wasn't replaced by a single successor. He was replaced by an entire era that was built on the lessons he taught. And that is a much rarer, much more profound form of legacy than a simple empire. An empire crumbles when its king dies. But an architecture? An architecture survives its builder. Pedro didn't build an empire of personality. He built an architecture of process. So, what exactly made his legacy so permanent, so unerasable? He fundamentally changed three key dimensions of the trade. First, he revolutionized logistics. He moved the entire operation from scattered, improvised ground movements to a highly organized aviation-based system. Before him, coordination was a messy affair. After him, sophisticated coordination became the absolute minimum requirement to even compete. He didn't just innovate. He made his innovation the new standard. Second, he proved the power of centralized leadership. In a world defined by fragmentation and chaotic rivalries, he demonstrated that a single, stable leadership could bring order and unprecedented efficiency to the industry. After Pedro, disparate factions stopped reveling in chaos and started actively seeking the structure and stability he had pioneered. He taught them that unity meant power. And third, and perhaps most importantly, he produced successors through a system of mentorship, not by bloodline. This was a radical departure from tradition. In his world, legacy was usually about passing power to your son or your brother. Pedro changed that. He identified talent, he trained it, and he created a new generation of leaders based on merit and skill. Mentorship replaced inheritance, ensuring that the knowledge, not just the power, was passed down. The history of outlaws is filled with famous, charismatic figures. But if you look closely, very few of them actually rewrote the fundamental rules of the industry they operated in. Most just played the game better than others. Pedro Avilés Pérez didn't just play the game. He redesigned the entire board. So when we try to place him in history, we see something unique. Pedro didn't become a legend because of how he lived his life or how he met his end. He became a legend because the world that came after him could never go back to the world that existed before him. He is the quiet, uncredited first chapter of what would later be known as the Sinaloa-era. He's the ghost in the machine, the predecessor whose innovations long outlived his own breath. He is not remembered with loud fanfare or dramatic stories. He is remembered structurally. The very map of the trade, to this day, still bears his invisible fingerprints. The first great architect of the modern drug trade left behind no grand monuments, no statues in his name. He left something far more enduring, a template, and that template changed everything.
The case may be closed, but criminology never sleeps. Like and subscribe at join Criminology, and step deeper into the dark with us.